Greetings, everyone. Welcome once again to the Feminine Mojo Show here on Blog Talk Radio. I'm your host, Jamie Walters, author and creatrix of IVC and the Feminine Mojo Projects. You'll find more information and inspiration on the Feminine Mojo Projects and reclaiming your own feminine mojo at www.ivysea.com. We all have the invitation right now in these transformative times to align with the wisdom and power of our hearts, reclaim the feminine and the deep wisdom we have access to. These gifts and practices help us navigate, vision, co-create, and orienteer in the midst of changes and transformations that are afoot. And they're gifts and ways of being and seeing that we've been systematically oriented away from in our culture. So join me in the Feminine Mojo Mystery School, and we've got some new surprises to unveil over the coming week or so. But you can explore with us the feminine more deeply to embody and express it as it wants to express through you. There are already audio programs in the archives on the medial feminine, Persephone and Inanna wisdom, Bridget, and inspiration of the initiations. Circe, as she inspires us to weave magic into our everyday ways of being and activities, the Black Madonna, and more. All of these are really potent archetypes and deeply awakening and catalyzing stories. And so much of our shows, and this show today as well, bring to life the living memory within us that we have when we hear some of these stories and when we look at and reacquaint ourselves with some of the symbols. So you'll find more in the Feminine Mojo Mystery School, including some of the new changes and evolutions that are going to be unveiled over the next week or so, and other Feminine Mojo projects, Sophia's Children blog, and the other resources at ivysea.com. And one other reminder before we begin today's conversation, remember that you can download the Feminine Mojo shows from the archive. It used to be that you could download the MP3s directly, and that was a whole lot easier, but you can still find that to download and listen to the shows via iTunes or one of your other players if you'd like, or you can listen to them on your browser as well as you're going throughout your day. So you'll find all of those in the Feminine Mojo Show archives. There's so many wonderful conversations that are deeply inspiring and deeply awakening for some of the things that we really are called to remember right now. So now for today's Feminine Mojo-inspired dialogue with John Lamb Lash. If you're listening live and want to call in with questions for John during the show, and it'll be another in-depth one, the number is 347-989-1293. That's in the U.S., 347-989-1293. And you'll find that also on the Feminine Mojo Show page as well. This is the fifth in a powerful series of inspired conversations about the Sophia story and the mysteries, and how wisdom of the mystery schools and ancient shamanic traditions is very, very, very alive and relevant and practical and timely today. We might not think so, but once you start hearing it, it makes so much sense. And in the first four interviews, the first four conversations that have been part of this really rich Sophia series, and you'll find them again in the Feminine Mojo Show archives. But John and I talked about the story of Sophia Gaia, the mysteries and the wisdom that is so valuable to us now. We talked about our divine inheritance and what that divine endowment are, what those divine gifts are that we've been endowed with, and what gets in the way of our knowing and expressing these gifts. In the fourth show, John shared more of his own experiential wisdom with the divine light, or the organic light of Sophia Gaia, that's part of the heart of the mysteries. And today, in this fifth conversation about Sophia Mysteries, John and I will be talking about sacred relationship, the gender split, gender love, and gender healing that's really vital to us now. We'll talk about what the roots of that gender split are, and perhaps a surprising potential connection in the relationship that we now see unfolding, and maybe understanding it a little bit differently than we might have at one point, of the relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus, for one example of these types of things. So if you're not already familiar with John Lash's work, he's the author of Not in His Image, Gnostic Vision, Sacred Ecology, and the Future of Belief. If you haven't read it yet, do put it on your list. And you'll also find John's work and wisdom on metahistory.org and on the Sophia Returning the Path to Planetary Tantra DVD. And you'll find that at sacredmysteries.com, and you'll find information at John's site, metahistory.org, as well. John Lamb Lash is often called the true successor of Mircea Eliade and the rightful heir of the great mythologist Joseph Campbell. He's a self-educated independent scholar who combines studies and experimental mysticism to teach directive mythology. That is the application of myth to life rather than its mere interpretation. So really bringing it alive. And he has also authored The Seeker's Handbook, Twins and the Double, The Hero, Manhood and Power, and The Quest for the Zodiac. Once more, you'll find more about John at his website, metahistory.org. Welcome back to the Feminine Mojo Show, John.
It's great to be back again. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It's always a pleasure, and it's always so wonderful to see what emerges and unfolds and evolves in our conversations. So I'm sure this will be no different.
We've been on quite a journey here, and I think the Magic 5 has arrived. So, as they say in Hollywood, let's cut to the chase, or in this case, let's cut to the love scene.
Hey, that's what everybody wants to see anyway. We just have to have good context, so we know what story we're living, right?
Precisely. We have to know what is the context of the love scene. That's exactly true. Beautifully said.
So we'll circle back around to just a minute, John, but usually, as you know, I like to start by recapping the connection between these subjects and the Sophia or Sophia story, kind of creating that golden thread or revealing that golden thread between our conversations. And by defining the terms we're using so we're all aligned and we can move forward together from a foundation of shared understanding and energy connection. But today I'd like to dive into the subject through another doorway and perhaps circle back to those connections and definitions as we deepen into this conversation. So one story, an example of sacred relationship and perhaps the gender healing that's surfacing more recently, or that we have an invitation to become aware of and engaged in, is that of Mary Magdalene and Jesus from what ultimately became Christianity or the Christian tradition. Understand that I'm not talking here about were they married and did they have children brouhaha stirred up by the Da Vinci Code and other of its sources. That is a very fine question and an area of exploration if you're into it, and as it happens, I don't actually care. But for me, that's kind of a tabloid culture style distraction from far more important and juicy issues. So alternatively, I resonate very deeply with a piece of John's writing about this famous pair. So I'd like to use that as a springboard into our conversation on this gender split, gender healing issue that we'll be exploring in depth today. John, the piece I'm talking about is where you explore Jesus and Mary Magdalene as possible telestai, given that their examples seem, from what we know, to very much sync up. Would you take a short bit of time to share more about this with the listeners? What are telestai, and how might that example sync up with the example of Jesus and Mary Magdalene? And then we'll kind of move right from there into this conversation about different ways of seeing gender split and gender healing. Can you share more about Jesus, Magdalene, and telestai?
Sure. Happy to follow your lead here. I think that to revisit this topic just for a moment is important. After all, let's not forget that the Da Vinci Code book and the whole scandal of Mary Magdalene, if you want to call it that was produced during those years, did create a tremendous uproar and brought the figure of Mary Magdalene to the attention of many people in the world who had been entirely ignorant of her. I think you would agree with that.
Absolutely.
Of course, I've debated whether or not, it's one thing to bring her to the attention of the world. It's another thing as to how she was handled in public attention. And you've pointed out that you've been reading my piece, The Gnostic Avenger. There are 3 key pieces, the only things that anyone needs to read on metahistory.org to get an orientation to this subject today that we're discussing, Jamie, is The Gnostic Avenger, She Who Anoints, which is a review of a book by Karen King, a feminist Gnostic scholar, and The Myth of Choice, which is in 3 parts, which discusses the relation between Jesus and Magdalene from a pagan point of view. And the second part of that Myth of Choice is called The Backstory, and that does give an actual profile of, as you're suggesting, a profile of a way that we might picture these 2 characters in ancient times. picturing them as telestai, that is to say, initiated or illuminated teachers from the mystery schools. So it's really worth revisiting this Christ Magdalene scenario in that respect, and then rebounding off that again to the subject of gender healing and so forth. It's a great place to start. So I would start in this way. I would say that I just want to address as quickly as possible and as lucidly as possible 2 really essential points of orientation. The first one concerns this annoying notion, which I really found really disturbing when the Da Vinci Code came out. In fact, I found it disturbing when Holy Blood, Holy Grail came out, which was 20 years before the Da Vinci Code. And some people may not know it, but a nonfiction book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, written by Michael Bagent and Lincoln and Lai, by three authors, L-E-I-G-H, Bagent, Lincoln, and Lai, was the basis upon which Dan Brown drew the novel, The Da Vinci Code. And it is that book, published I think around the late 70s, that presents this notion to which I strongly object. Namely, Mary Magdalene was a key figure in ancient times. She was an important figure in the biblical New Testament scenario, but only to the degree as she served as a kind of breed mare for a theocratic lineage. So, or a trophy wife for the Messiah, if you want to put it in those terms.
Oh my God. Yeah, I hear you.
So we're getting this message, which to me, I was so upset. And, it's interesting because, interesting timing that metahistory.org, which is largely dedicated, well, totally dedicated to Gaia Sophia and equally dedicated to Magdalene as a human representative of the divine Sophia, came online in July 2002. And that was when the Da Vinci Code thing just was really cranking up. So I put quite a bit of material on about her at that time. As I say, if you just look at the 3 pieces that I just cited, which you'll find under on the MM connection in the site, it covers that material. Well, this is what I object to, and this is what Gnostics of the time would have objected to. Mary Magdalene, as the partner of Jesus or wife of Jesus, could not have been a woman who bore his children for the purpose of establishing a theocratic lineage in the world. That is entirely perverse. That is entirely perverse from the viewpoint of the pagan background, but equally from the viewpoint of Gnostics. Gnostics were teachers in the mystery schools. They were educated and illuminated intellectuals. They were the intelligentsia of their time. Not just the intelligentsia, they were the flower of the whole intelligentsia of the pagan world. And they were deeply gifted and skilled as mystics and shamans, and deeply versed in the mysteries of eroticism, of sexual tantra, as well as in problems of theology and science and metaphysics. They were polymaths, people who were educated in different fields of knowledge. Now, what happens if we place Jesus and Mary Magdalene in this framework? Let's say that we try to re-envision them independent of any of the attributes given to them by Christianity, and try to see what they would have been as telestai, teachers in the mystery schools. Well, in the first place, they would not have procreated a sacred blood lineage, because the idea of a sacred blood lineage is actually one of the most demonic ideas on this planet. It is just a pretext for a form of New World Order mentality. It is a dominator system. The sacred bloodline concept belongs to the dominator system, period. And there is no way that you can fiddle that concept there is no way that you can manipulate and fiddle the sacred bloodline idea and have it work out well for the human race.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's nothing but a variation of that which I have condemned in my book, Not in His Image. It's a variation of the chosen people concept.
Yeah.
And the chosen people concept divides humanity. And the chosen people concept destroys our essential sense of the unity of the human species. So, if Christ and Magdalene had lived as pagan initiates, as I described in these articles on metahistory.org, they would have taught the true identity of humanity. They would have taught what Gnostic scholars like Karen King call the Anthropos doctrine. What is the Anthropos doctrine? Well, in the hands of Gnostic scholars, it's a rather complicated and technical affair. It takes you into all kinds of early Christian theology. It takes you into the ideology of the Church Fathers. It takes you into the conception of the Pauline idea of Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the supernatural. All of that is disinformation. Understood from the viewpoint of the people who originated the Anthropos doctrine, it's very simple. It is the true and authentic, livable and testable concept of our own human identity. So, if we really know who we are, if we really know who the Anthropos is, what it means to be human, then we would have a sense of what Christ, of what Jesus and Magdalene would have taught and would have propagated as teachers coming out of the mystery schools. And they would not have taught that they were the mom and pop operation of a theocratic bloodline. And so that's really where the battle line is drawn. Where are you going to put your imagination? Where are you going to put the forces of your heart? Are you going to put them with the generic or universal sense of humanity, including both the genders? Or are you going to put them into this elitist New World Order domination scheme of a sacred bloodline? You see?
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, it's interesting because between the two, and I agree, first of all, that Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and several books that sourced it, and the Da Vinci Code and Margaret Starbird's work has really elevated and brought into a different level of public conversation the story of Mary Magdalene and what might have been the case and what we might not have known and what we might have been misled about. But what's really struck me when I read the Gnostic Avenger articles about Mary Magdalene that you're talking about, and this example of Jesus and Magdalene potentially as telestai, is that there's a lot that would suggest that that would be true. You know, from people accusing Jesus of being an Egyptian sorcerer and all of this, but one of the they went in pairs, you know, male and female teachers, and so there were lots of things. So listeners definitely read those because there are a lot of similarities, and I thought as much of this, John, it's very empowering. You know, when we really start seeing what we start tracing back the roots, the power roots of these traditions, and remembering we can see these things in a completely different way, and they're much greater sources of inspiration, not as a source of spiritual entertainment, but, I mean, the real type of thing that awakens a remembering in our very bodies, you know, and that seems to me to be so important these days.
Absolutely. You know, Gnosticism or Gnosis, which is cognitive ecstasy, or the knowing of things in a rapturous or ecstatic state of attention. And that kind of knowing, which was practiced by the telestai, is totally embodied. Gnostic knowledge is totally embodied. And it does extend into the supernatural. It does extend to the metaphysical. It extends all the way to the pleroma, which is the very core and hub of the galaxy we inhabit. But the wonderful thing about it is that all the way from here, the realm of the senses, to the pleroma and back, can be explored by embodied knowledge. It's the knowledge of the body-mind. It's not a disembodied knowledge. And that's a really key thing. And so when we go back to dip into Gnosticism again, we don't have to go back and make a full lifetime commitment to make a tour of the ancient world. Nor is it a kind of nostalgic trip, going back to something that we lost.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that this important Gnostic information that's come to light recently allows us to touch our own resources, the resources in ourselves. That's why it's so powerful.
And that's exactly it. It kind of, I know you speak of in the Tree Nymph series, and also, the concept of analeptic or ancestral or cellular memory. That's
right.
where reacquainting ourselves, hearing the stories, because they're not just flat one-dimensional stories. There is something of an energy transmission that, from my perspective and my experience, awakens that analeptic or cellular or ancestral memory, so that there's suddenly embodied, there's that kind of knowing. There's a knowing, but from that, questions arise. We start, as Rilke would say, asking into. We learn to love the
That's
questions,
right.
and they lead us into openings, and we hear these stories, and they awaken even more of that ancestral or cellular knowing. So it's really powerful, and that's why the aberration of some of these stories, and since we've been talking about Jesus and Magdalene, we'll just use that as an example, because gosh knows there's so many more, and your book and writings really talk about the damage of this. But with Jesus and Magdalene, like you said, we either have Jesus as the Savior, the Messiah, and
Messiah,
that meant anointed one, and Magdalene as a prostitute, or as you just said, the better option is Jesus and Magdalene
that they're equal.
As
that they're
parenting,
equal teachers.
right?
That's right.
But they're parenting and producing this sacred line. And what the telestai example gives us is that they were incredibly well-initiated, beloved and respected teachers, of the mysteries and embodiments of the mysteries, and therefore awakeners of the mysteries. And they were two parts of, one might say, a whole. They went out male and female together. And so this is where it's a really powerful example. And perhaps, John, that this suggests, as we go into this conversation about gender split and gender healing, gender love, that this suggests that there was evidence of a very different perspective on gender within the telestai, and it seems like that probably was a fairly dangerous proposition in the minds of some of the dominator-minded folks who perpetuated after that. But the telestai saw gender a little bit differently, obviously.
Well, we can talk about... We can go directly into that, and that is exactly the focus that I would like to take. Before I go there, I would like to just add one remark to complement what you said. I spent so much of my life, restoring this Gnostic message, the real message of Gnosticism. I'm not like these other scholars who quibble about the meaning of textual passages.
Mm-hmm.
They get lost quibbling about the meaning of these texts. I go right to the original message. And that message is as alive and powerful today as it ever was. So Gnosticism is a journey into the divine knowing of what it means to be human. And that is the most empowering journey we can take. And the journey is more beautiful and more complete if we take it together as men and women.
Mm-hmm. Simply
because men and women are the two modal variations, as it were, of the humanity, of the anthropos. Karen King makes this grand statement, Mary of Magdalene was wonderful because she demonstrates the legitimate exercise of authority in instructing the world.
Mm-hmm.
But instructing the world in what?
Mm-hmm.
We have to understand that Mary of Magdala, as a Gnostic initiate, would have instructed the world in exactly what we are speaking of today in our conversation. Not in Christian salvationism, not in the message of the Father God, not in his commandments, not in his son or the sacrifice of his son, not in the end of the world scenario. She would have instructed in the origin and meaning of the anthropos, the true origin and meaning of humanity. And that is what is called the image of the true human. And the Coptic word for that is Petilios Rome. Rome is the beautiful Coptic word for humanity. Rome, R-H-O-M-E. And Telios is the same as the root of the word telestai. But it doesn't mean perfect. It means the ultimate, the true, the absolute ultimate that you can be. So here there is already a message. What does it mean to be a real human being? It means to be the ultimate of what you can be as a person. That's when you're really human. So there's a fantastic, empowering potential in this message, and also a great responsibility to carry this message, because it's not an intellectual message, and you must embody it and transmit it if you carry it.
Yeah, and that is the beautiful thing about what remains. And as you said, sometimes we have to interpret the remains or what have been handed down to us from fragments of the
fragments of lost teachings,
the arguments against heresy and things like that of the church fathers. But we can still piece together, and then if we combine that with just things that are arising through inspiration or analeptic memory, we're starting to piece together at least what resonates enough in our body to awaken these sorts of things. But, so...
Jamie, if I might refer more directly to your question.
Sure.
That I was a little digression there, but I'd like to refer back directly to your question and again bring up a point that many readers will have considered because it arises in everyone's mind. But why was this knowledge that the Gnostics had, that the Gnostic Jesus and Magdalene had about humanity so dangerous that it had to be eliminated by centuries of repression and murder? Why was it so dangerous? It's very simple. It has to do with a war between two paradigms. There was a paradigm that arose in the Judeo-Christian tradition of the master-slave relationship between God and humanity. And as you probably know, this paradigm is getting a lot of recycling today to the so-called Sitchin or Anunnaki scenario.
Yeah.
Everybody's been hearing about this, and a lot of people are buying into this. We're being told that there are ancient Sumerian cuneiform texts that describe how the human race was created to be a slave race by a master race of advanced extraterrestrials, right? That mythology is not so different from the very theme that is stated in the book of Genesis. Humanity has a master-slave relationship to the Creator according to the Abrahamic religions. And we are made to serve the Creator, to follow His rules, and we shall be judged and approved, win His approval by following His rules, or condemned if we don't. That paradigm arose at a certain point in historical time, and the Gnostics saw how dangerous it was. And they had another paradigm. And their paradigm had to be eliminated. Because if their paradigm had existed as an option, people would have chosen their paradigm. Because it's the true paradigm. And it's not a master-slave relationship. But it is a paradigm that tells us that we are the creations of the divine imagination of the goddess. And we are not made in her image either. We're not either made in the image of a male Father God, nor are we made in her image. We are not made in her image. We are inventions of her imagination. And the wonderful thing about that is that we are interactive inventions of her imagination. She's the dreamer. We're the characters in the dream. This is the metaphor that I'm currently using. And in the lucid dream, the characters in the dream, which would be human beings, men and women, can interact with the dreamer, which is Sophia, the goddess of the pleroma who dreamed us into being in the first place. Now, this is the paradigm that the Gnostic initiates and telestai would have taught as an option to the paradigm of biblical creation that we find in the Bible. Take your pick. Which one you like? Which one do you like better? Which one sounds more playful? Which one sounds more healing?
There's no contest on that one, John. Which is no doubt why it was so dangerous that it had to be eradicated by such pronounced and consistent violence.
Totally. There is no contest. If they had allowed any shred of this option, of this vision of humanity that we are talking about now, that is as alive today as it was in the mystery schools, that is kept alive by people like you and I and people who are listening to this interview, in our embodied desire to find the divine humanity, there wouldn't have been a chance in hell, if you'll excuse my expression, that Christianity would have come to power. And we would not be facing the nightmare we are currently facing on this planet with the dominator system, which largely uses the Judeo-Christian framework of guilt and programming to dominate and enslave people.
Yeah.
And that is our story. That's the story in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we can feel and see the truth of that as well, because on one hand, one of those paradigms fosters that sense of connection, co-creation, playfulness, devotion, just a real full sensory embodiment and all of that. And then the other is, fear-centered, severing, scarcity. We can sort of see. Yeah.
That's right. Domination, division, scarcity. Men and women, they're either against each other or they are united in the cause of a dominator ethos.
Mm-hmm. And, this is really time to birth something else. There's no doubt, and I know that so many of us feel that sort of calling arising, perhaps from Sophia herself, or whatever, but it's coming right up through our bodies that, enough of this. This is just a story that so many of us, I've heard my own, peeps, my friends say, I don't want to participate in or support this particular story, this lie anymore. There's a different way that's calling, and perhaps that's, what we're all contributing to and asking these questions and sharing these types of things that, remember, because one of the things most people say is, well, it's always been this way. Well, it hasn't always been this way.
No, it hasn't always been this way. No, not at all.
At least in terms of the choice between the stories or the awareness of the divine potential and the partnership. It's like Rianne Eisler's work. She talks about the dominator versus in contrast with the partnership.
There were partnership societies. Now, I want to add a qualification here. I'm not saying that human societies in the classical world, in the pre-Christian world, were perfect.
Right.
No human society has ever been perfect. I'm not saying that, and it would be a mistake to idealize them
of course.
In that manner. But what I'm saying is, they had that option that was taken away from us. This is the whole reason. I swear to you, at the risk of sounding like a one-idea person, I must say that this is the whole reason why we're lost and why there is such agony and anguish in the world and there is such conflict between the sexes, because that option was taken away from us. Mm-hmm. As long as that option of that vision of humanity is present in any society, all of the good parts, the good elements of human potential will organize themselves around that option. Mm-hmm. And you will have a good enough society. You won't have a perfect one, but you will have one in which the spirit of coexistence and the general good preponderates over the bad tendencies, which is exactly the opposite of the world we have today, which is where the bad tendencies preponderate over the good.
Yeah, that's certainly what gets the most attention, for sure. So as we're talking about that, and I'm hearing that a little bit of that the playback you had mentioned earlier just before our show with your microphone, so you might want to move forward towards it or what have you. But that kind of seems a good launching pad into this whole conversation on, that there was a different choice, an alternative choice, a paradigm, and in seeing gender and in the connection with both the spirit in nature and earth and the stories that we had inherited that awakened that, or that continued, that provided that golden thread of that connection with nature and connection with our divinity, if you want to call it that, and then the severing of that. So there was a real breach, that schism or severing of the connection between masculine and feminine, between the genders. You've called that the gender split, right?
The gender rift, yeah. The gender rift or gender split, right.
So what does that mean? Where did it originate and how does it show up? I mean, I think we can all make the leap in how it shows up, but where did it start?
Okay, there are two ways to look at the gender split from the perspective of the mystery school teachers. The gender split was one of the 4 or 5 great topics in their ongoing conversations and in their teaching and education of the human race. Just as they were deeply concerned with the problem of the archons and of an archontic or non-human distortion and insanity in our species, of which I've spoken a great deal.
And in our first or second conversation, we spoke about that in some depth, so listeners can definitely go back to conversations 1 and 2 and find lots of great information on the archontic influence. But please continue.
That's what I call how we are deviated. That was a great subject. That was one of their great topics. And another one of their great topics was the gender split. Now, there are 2 ways to look at how the gender split happened. And I would point out something that's extremely important today from a Gnostical point of view. When we go back and look into the past for the origin of a problem today, we want to go back and form as clear a picture as we can of how it originated, but we don't want to get swamped by going into the past and working out every single detail, because we can actually get lost going into the past looking for the reasons of our confusion today. So it's very important that we focus on the essential truth about the past. From the Gnostic viewpoint, there were 2 factors in the gender split. One was prehistorical, going back to the very remote reaches of time when human beings first appeared on our planet, or even before humans first started to emerge on the earth. A deep prehistorical, prehistorical perspective. And the second was a particular moment or event in history when that split became radical, when it became, it manifested in an extremely dangerous manner. So those are the 2 things that they looked at continually. And I'd like to try to give a cogent summary of what they were. So we'll start out first with the first event that happened in the remote reaches of time. Okay?
That sounds great, John.
We have to bear in mind that the Gnostics were mystic visionaries who looked into time. They had this analeptic memory. They had the capacity for shamanic recall. And they actually had a complete vision of the origin of the human race and how it eventually appeared on Earth. Now, I have to tell you that when you read the book of Genesis, which is where most people get their picture of the creation of the world and the emergence of humanity, well, that's one picture. But that ain't nothing like you're going to see when you go into the Gnostic movie theater. The picture in the Gnostic movie theater, first of all, is spectacular, cinemascopic, panoramic picture of the origins of our species, which is highly detailed and very deep. Basically, what they say is that the human genome, the template for the human species, which they call the anthropos, was engineered in the galactic center. That is, in the core of the galaxy in which the solar system is located. And they called that place the Pleroma. And they considered it to be the habitation of divine beings or gods called aeons. The best translation of the word aeon is a generator. And these divine generators were of male and female kind, and they ought to be pictured as great torrents of living, sentient luminosity, of intelligent light and love. They ought not to be pictured in a human form as angelic or human-type creatures, but rather as great serpentine currents. And two of these great divine serpentine entities, who were called Christos and Sophia by some accounts, Gnostic accounts. They were also called Sophia and Telestai by another account, conceived and engineered the whole human experiment. So, according to the Gnostics, the human race was not created by the Anunnaki or some advanced ET civilization. We were created by superhuman beings in the galactic center.
Mm-hmm.
And when this template of our species, which we call the genome, was engineered and conceived by these beings, the anthropos had a kind of androgyne quality. In other words, both sexes were contained in each other. There was not a radical anatomical division of the sexes as we have now. Now, this is very, very, very important part of the story, because there is something that Gnostic scholars have repeated through the ages, but no single one of them has been able to explain why this is so.
Mm-hmm.
They have repeated the fact that the Gnostics were against procreation. This is a fact that has come down from classical times.
Mm-hmm.
And scholars like Elaine Pagels and Karen King and others, Kurt Rudolph, Hans Jonas, they repeat this like a rumor, but without understanding why. Why were Gnostics against procreation? It seems like to be against procreation would be to be against humanity, right?
Right,
because
yeah.
How is humanity going to survive if we don't procreate? Well, the only way that I can tell you to solve that riddle, and it is a riddle, is to understand the Gnostics' vision of the origination of our species in the mind of Sophia. So I'm going to ask you now, put yourself into her mind, put yourself into the mind of the goddess as she conceived and imagined the human race before it even appeared on any planet. And when you put yourself into her mind, you try to imagine that she had a particular way of conceiving our species. She endowed it with certain properties and attributes. She endowed it with certain capacities and gifts. You know, it's been really a great pleasure having this series of talks with you, Jamie, because in the past we have actually specified what some of these attributes were that Sophia endowed in us. For instance, metanoia, dianoia, epinoia, and these various capacities of the human species. Do you remember how we went over that series?
Yes, exactly, and talked about what each of those means and what sort of gift it is and how we use them and how we might use them in greater alignment with the divine intention. So that's, again, I think it's the third conversation maybe, but it's in the descriptions. So. Listeners can find them in the archives.
I believe so. That is a really key part of Gnostic teaching, which is very relevant today when you understand that your capacity for self-correction. Mm-hmm. That is, you can make a mistake as a human being, but you can see and correct your error. This is a divine endowment in our species from the goddess. the capacity of metanoia, the ability to create a certain paradigm, grow and evolve within that paradigm, and then outgrow that paradigm and move into a greater paradigm. This is another divine gift. The capacity of dianoia, which you and I are demonstrating right now, of dialogue, of exchange and communication back and forth to compare and exchange ideas. Okay, we have that set of divine attributes, but what we can ask ourselves now, something that has not yet been asked. If we put ourselves in the mind of the divine Sophia who engineered our species, what was her preconception of how we would reproduce? That's an interesting question. Because she conceived us as an animal species. She conceived us as a species with a head and 4 limbs, mobile, a kind of animal, kind of starfish-shaped creature that would have 5 senses and that we would reproduce. But what was her original conception of how we would reproduce?
Dreaming it into being. If we're made in the image of our Creator, who is a dreamer into being. That would be my guess.
That is exactly right. By dreaming and by play, especially by erotic play. Now, one of the things, and this is really one of, to me, and I'm so happy for the opportunity to say this, because it's the first time I've had to come out and say this openly. What I'm going to say now is one of the most exciting and stunning things that I have recovered from the Gnostic vision. According to the original conception of our species by Sophia, we were not meant to reproduce by mitosis, but by meiosis. Now, if you Google these 2 words, you can really have quite an educational experience. Because in fact, it turns out that on this planet Earth, and let's talk about the planet Earth exclusively right now, because that's our environment, and that's also her body, there are 2 forms of reproduction, not one. One of them is called meiosis, and this is cell division. This is how an amoeba divides, okay? Everyone has seen this, right? At some point or another, we've seen an illustration of this blob, which is an amoeba. And then we see it moving and kind of dancing around, and then it separates, and suddenly it's 2 amoeba, which are called the daughter cells of the mother cell. And then each of the daughter cells separates into 2 other amoeba. Everyone has seen this. This is called meiosis. M-E-I-O-S-I-S. Now, actually, meiosis is the primary form of reproduction on this planet. Did you know that?
No, well, I imagine if I actually thought about it, yes.
If you thought about it, you'd realize it was.
That, well, if it breaks down to the smallest parts of us, that would be how everything reproduces.
The amoebic level, and also many animal species, actually, and sea-going creatures, reproduce in this way, by meiosis. What we say, when we look at, we're told that this exists, but we're never told how important it is, Jamie, how important it is. And we could say that Gaia Sophia, in her preference for reproduction, prefers meiosis. Now, there is a second form of reproduction that happens on this planet, and that is when 2 creatures of the same species, who are anatomically differentiated into male and female, like a male frog and a female frog, get together. They do that funny humping thing, and they reproduce. That is called mitosis. Mitosis is a conjugal propagation of 2 members of a species of different sexes. Okay? Now, this is where you get into the deep, deep Gnostic territory that is fantastically liberating. Gnostics looked at human beings, and they saw the man with his anatomical definition. His body is anatomically defined, and his genitalia anatomically defined in a particular way. He's the seed bearer. He gives the seed by anatomical definition. Then they looked at the woman. They saw her body is anatomically defined with breasts, with a womb, with a different structure of genitalia. And her body is designed to receive the seed, and only in the womb of the female of the human species does humanity develop. A man cannot give birth to another human being. Only a woman can.
Mm-hmm.
The Gnostics looked at this, and guess what they said? They said,
what?
This is not the way it was intended to be. We were not intended to reproduce mitotically by sexual conjugation. That's why they were against procreation. Because in their deep vision of the prehistory of humanity, they went all the way back to the conception of our species in the mind of the goddess herself. Try to imagine that reach of imagination. Try to grasp that reach of imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And when they put themselves back in the mind of the divine Sophia in the pleroma center, they saw that she conceived humanity as a sort of an androgyne species that would become more loosely defined into a male and female type, but that the male and female types would play with each other, and they would stimulate and excite each other erotically and reproduce in that manner, but they would not reproduce through a mechanical, organic seeding in the womb of the woman that produces the birth of a new species through the body of the woman. And we actually fell into this kind of reproduction that we do today by a cosmic accident. In her view, she would prefer that we would produce meiotically, which means just exactly as you said, that reproduction would occur as an act of excitation and stimulation between a man and a woman, but it would not occur through the actual mechanics of sexual intercourse.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a very wild stretch of imagination that I'm proposing there, but that is, to my understanding, what they actually considered to be our dilemma. And so, to answer the first part of the question, the gender split began when we evolved in a way that brought us to mitotic reproduction and took us away from this ecstatic and playful form of reproduction that she originally intended for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened because of something that she did, she herself. If you want to blame anyone for that division of the sexes, as it's called in the old mythological themes, she is actually responsible for that accident. So naturally, she is very concerned that we should heal that wound and that accident, that error, and that we should return to the kind of reproduction that she intended for us.
Well, and if we talk about the capacity, those divine gifts or the gifts that are part of the divine endowment, and one being able to create one paradigm, outgrow it, recognize options, and then make adjustments or corrections and create a new paradigm, that would be a possibility given the divine gifts that we've been endowed with. Yeah?
Yeah, we've been given the gift to do this. Absolutely, I agree with you. But first we have to have sort of, we have to understand what this challenge really implies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I know I'm really taking a very big leap here, but it's necessary to take this leap in order to go to the core of the gender problem. There's a second aspect, which is historically when it went wrong. That's another matter which we can come to here in a moment. Just let me add this, perhaps for clarification. I'm sure that some people who are listening to this for the first time are thinking this is pretty wild, you know, and like, well, what would be meiotic reproduction between human beings rather than mitotic reproduction?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Well, if we were reproducing meiotically, which is in the way that Gaia originally conceived for our species, you, Jamie, and me, John, would reproduce a double of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But we would reproduce that double by a kind of mystical or erotic intercourse with someone of the opposite gender. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, to take a really wild example, if you and I were to have the kind of intercourse that Gaia originally intended for our species, we would merge our energetic bodies together. And we would have a very intense erotic play between us, a ritual type of play. You see these rituals of eroticism in all the animal kingdoms, don't you? Especially among the birds.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what sex would be. Sex would not be the literal act of intercourse. It would be more of a ritual and energetic intercourse. And in the result of that intercourse that you and I would have, your frequency would be so heightened that you would actually excrete a double version of yourself, a second Jamie. And that Jamie would take over your life. And the first Jamie that produced it would die. And then there would be the second one. And in that way, we would actually have eternal life through reproducing our own doubles.
It kind of lends a different sort of potential meaning to being born again.
Totally.
Doesn't it?
We would be born again over and over again through our own pleasure and through the intensity of our own of our connection, you see? And the purpose as the way, try to get your mind and your emotions around the way that she conceived this.
Mm-hmm.
She wanted the individual, she wanted us to be gendered, okay? She wanted us to be male and male because the gender division is inherent in humanity. But the gender conflict was produced by a set of circumstances that she did not anticipate.
Mm-hmm.
But according to the gender division, we would excite the real humanity in each other. We would erotically and energetically excite each other by our sharing of humanity. And then we would propagate ourselves as human beings. There would have been no physical propagation of the human species through the body of a woman. We would have produced our own doubles in the way that an amoeba splits and divides and produces a daughter cell of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Gnostics understood this. They understood that this was Sophia's original conception of reproduction for humanity, and that's why they rejected the form of reproduction that we currently use.
Mm-hmm. Now, that makes a lot of sense. And then you mentioned, too, that there was another event that, or series of events that was a little bit closer to us in history, prehistory, that really took that aberration or that mistake into a whole different level of gender split.
Okay, let me give you that in 3 minutes, and this is extremely important, and maybe we could go into this in another talk. The ancient societies that were gender balanced, as Leanne Eisner suggests, the ancient societies that had telestai in their midst, and shamans and mystics who guided the society by this deep, deep perception of our origins, knew there was something wrong with the sexual balance. And so they devised a method to compensate for that and deal with it. And that method has been, is not my invention or my supposition, believe me. That method was originally redefined and discovered by Merlin Stone, who wrote When God Was a Woman. And she was one of the pioneers of the so-called goddess reclamation scholarship that we are beneficiaries of today. You with your wonderful work of Feminine Mojo and me with my Gnostic revival. We are beneficiaries of the goddess reclamation movement. And Merlin Stone explains that in pre-Christian societies centered on the figure of the goddess, there was a ritual called Gamos, or sacred mating, and that this ritual was required for the choice of a man to lead the community. One of the things that the ancient people realized is that a man, the male of the species, because of this gender split, because we are not an erotically and magically balanced species, as Gaia intended, that we are a more armored and a less armored species, a less armored genders. The more armored gender is the male. The less armored gender is the female who bears the species physically. This is not intended in this way. But due to the fact that it is this way, we need to compensate for that imbalance. And so ancient societies, the genius of the ancient peoples and of the mystics who advised them, devised this ritual. And that is the ritual of sexual initiation of the king candidate by the priestess of the earth. And these rituals are very clearly described in the work of Merlin Stone and other feminist scholars. The ritual was that in any community where a man would be king, a man would be a candidate to be the ruler of the community, who would impose rules of order, who would judge things that were wrong, and who would defend the community as a warrior, had first to pass a test. He had to have Gamos, or sacred intercourse, with the goddess who represented Sophia, or the divine feminine. Now, this Gamos has wrongly been interpreted by many scholars, such as the woman who wrote, what was her name? There's a woman who wrote a book about the Grail Mysteries. Jessie Weston, that was her name. Very much influenced T.S. Eliot, who wrote The Wasteland, and very, Jessie L. Weston, From Ritual to Romance. This book, From Ritual to Romance, made a mistake that many scholars have made that did not prevented us from understanding what I'm trying to explain today. They said that this ritual, whereby the man who would be king lay with the priestess of the tribe, was a fertility ritual. That's not true. It was not a fertility ritual. It was a masculinity test. And the purpose of this test was very simple. The people of the community realized that men, if they were given power, because they were over-armored, they were the armored gender, and that they had hormonal, physiological, and psychological tendencies toward the use of violence and force, that men given power and control would inevitably abuse it. Nevertheless, they needed to have some men to control and protect the community. And so they said, well, how are we going to choose the man that we can trust, that will not misuse his masculine force and not turn it against us if we entrust him with this role of king or theocrat? Well, this is what we'll do. We'll put it in the hands of a priestess of Gaia, of the divine feminine, who represents the matrix of the earth, which is the matrix of all tenderness. And we will see if he can treat her correctly in the sexual intercourse. We will give him 3 days with her. And she is, first of all, a mistress of all the erotic arts. She is capable of bringing not only any man, but also any woman to the absolute height of sexual rapture by her erotic talents. She is an object of beauty, a self-designated object of beauty. She is an instrument of divine erotic force. And we will give him 3 days with her. And there will be 2 tests that he must pass in these 3 days. First, he must show that he can please her in the way she wishes to be pleased without her telling him. So one condition of the priestess ritual was that the man had this woman, this beautiful sexual goddess, Devadasi, as she was called in Hindu, completely under his power. He could have done anything with her he wanted to. But the test was that he would give her the pleasure that she wished him to give her, and not merely the pleasure that he wished to take upon her.
Uh-huh.
That was the first test. Try to get your mind around that, man.
Yeah, that's a pretty big distinction.
That's a pretty big distinction. And the second test was, could he surrender all of his power to her without reservation?
Mm-hmm.
Could he become a pliable, malleable, vulnerable, powerless man in her arms? These were the criteria. And this is a fantastic ritual. Every Gaelic society described by Rian Eisler, every goddess-based and matrifocal society of the past used some variation of this ritual to test the man. And the man who could prove that he revered the desires of the woman higher than his own and could surrender to her in total tenderness was qualified to be king.
And, you know, John, that is a type of initiation rite as well, because you don't just show up without any guidance before something like that and do well, unless you have a real natural gift. But what you're describing in Hyros Gamos is it's an initiation rite, you know, perhaps exemplifying that a man had done enough of his own work, so to speak, or received instruction to the point where he was able to be an embodiment of what I might call the sacred masculine versus that raw, unbridled testosterone power.
That's right. The patriarchal dominator masculine.
Right.
That's right. It is true that the young men who underwent this test generally underwent it around the age of 25. Mm-hmm. And that they had already been selected at the age of 15 in adolescence and led toward this initiation. So there was a very long preparation for this initiation when they would have the honor of having these 3 days with the priestess. And out of that, the priestess came forth to the community and said, yes, this man is qualified. We can trust him with the power we're going to invest in a man which so easily gets out of control. But we can trust him because he has proven himself trustworthy by this rite. Now that rite was destroyed.
Yeah.
It took a long time to destroy it. Let's say first it was undermined, and then eventually it was entirely destroyed. Mm-hmm. It took a very long time to undermine and destroy that rite. At the beginning of that, I don't want to go into a long song and dance about this, but I'll just give you a sketch. You know Maria Gimbutas?
Yes.
Can't ignore her work. She pointed out that the matrifocal and goddess-oriented societies of the Middle East were destroyed by Kurgan invaders who appeared around 4000 BC. Kurgan invaders, Kurgan, were patriarchal warrior clans from the steppes of Russia. No one can exactly explain where these people came from, but they were warrior tribes dominated by men who had horses and chariots. Mm-hmm. And when they came down into the Middle East and into the Mediterranean, probably due to some climactic crisis in the region where they lived, they brought this impulse that acted against the natural inclinations of the societies that existed there. And there was a long battle that went on, and it lasted for about 2,500 years.
Yeah.
And eventually it resulted in the complete overthrow of this system. The result being that men did not rely on the test of the goddess of the priestess to qualify. They determined their own standards of qualification. They said
that's
men will
the fox
define.
put in charge of the hen house kind of metaphor.
That's right. The foxes took charge of the hen house. Men will define how men rule. We will not allow women to define us. We will not allow women to vet us and approve or disapprove of our ruling power. That took a very long time, but it eventually broke very, very badly. And this system, which actually preserved a kind of balance between the genders, was destroyed. And when this system was finally destroyed around 2500 BC, you find the rise of the great theocratic rulers who were entirely masculine. And the only thing that they did as a token acknowledgement of the previous system, and this is a horrible story, was that they kept, as a captive princess, one of the priestesses in their temple. And when people came to them and they said, well, how can you do, when they came to Sargon, for instance, of Akkad, and they said, well, Sargon, how can you proclaim yourself king of our nation when you have not undergone the ancient rite of Hieros Gamos with the priestess? Because that is the only thing that we know, that we can trust you. And he said, don't worry about that, folks. There she is in my penthouse on the top floor, you know. There she is, my Playboy prize. The priestess is still here, but she's just my prize now. She's the prize I win because I'm at the top of the heap. But she's not the one who qualifies me to be at the top of the heap. And when that turnaround happened, that was the beginning of the end for our species in terms of any kind of social justice or any kind of sane social or political rulership. So you can see why every single political problem in the world today is based on the gender split, is based on men who have gotten out of control and women who are either serving those men or are in some way accessory to the very crime itself. Women are now even accessory to this crime. So you cannot exempt women from the problem.
No, not at all. I mean, after everybody's been thoroughly masculinized or indoctrinated generation after generation through lots of violence into a dominator system, I mean, everybody at that point is colluding unless you're waking up and deciding not to anymore. And that's a tall task, as many of us can attest.
The original view of our humanity, unless we go back to the idea that each man and woman is responsible for carrying some part of the divine knowing of what it means to be human, what the Gnostics call the teleos rome, the true humanity, then we will not be able to rectify and heal this problem. So the healing that we have globally is based in a gender healing. This is my view.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's for some reason it's interesting because I just thought of the kind of updated version of the ancient practice of Ho'oponopono, you know, which the Hawaiian Kahuna Morna Simeona kind of updated and brought into the quantum age. You know, it's very inspired, but it holds those two as paradox, you know, in terms of what we see coming up around us in our lives or in the world. You know, we as microcosms hold an imprint of the cause of that, and yet also, you know, in clearing that out shamanically or energetically, we allow the opening for the divine gift or the divine essence, if you want to call it that, to come more fully into expression. So I was just, as you were describing what you were describing, I was seeing that Ho'oponopono version that was shared with the world through Morna Simeona, because it kind of does hold both of those as you know, awarenesses. Like on one hand, we have this dominator pattern, and you know, I as a microcosm hold that in my energetic field as well.
That's right.
And in healing that, I clear it out, also knowing that I hold this divine imprint. So it's kind of an as within, so without. I mean, and we're talking about masculine and feminine and men and women. So, you know, we've talked about this rendering this split or rift between the genders and between masculine and feminine, and how it came more fully into actual expression or experience in historical events But
That's right.
you've started to mention this gender love and gender healing as the medicine to heal this issue, or restore, if you will, the health at the root of the world tree, which I know you've used as an example. But,
Right.
John, I just want to share something that I noticed, and I think it was in the Three Nymphs series, but you'd written gender balance in the human species as an essential requirement for its physical survival. Gender love is the mutual affection of men and women in recognition of their sexual handicaps. There are many gender variants and merges, cross-gender dreamings and stalkings, but the basic sanity of the species depends upon the reconciliation of the main polarity, the male and female genders. These are some insights to be drawn from the myth of the tree-born shamans. So as I wanted to share that as an entree, or as we enter into this whole conversation of gender healing and what that
Right.
might mean, and how we embody and approach or become more aware of this.
I'd love to do that. I think we have about 15 minutes left. Is that correct?
We can actually go to 30 if we'd like.
Okay.
I
Okay.
edged us out a little bit more time, knowing that this was going to be a full and rich conversation. So.
Okay. Super. Well, I would like to address, if I can, in that context, you just defined. I'd like to address the mythological or the mythical aspect of gender healing and the energetic aspect.
Beautiful.
The mythical aspect of gender healing involves a total relearning of our origin as a species. To go back and relearn the story. Now, who has this story? Just John Lash? Is he the only person on Earth who has this story? Well, no. Many, many people have this story in the subliminal remembering of their own minds.
Mm-hmm.
And all I've done is created a kind of thread, a kind of hook for retrieving that story in each of us. And even that hook that I've created is not of my own devising, but I've constructed it out of the remnants of the Gnostic materials. So this Gnostic materials and the Gnostic mythology of the prehistory of our species is like the hook, the catalyst, that will inspire the divine remembering in each one of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I've given some outlines of this divine remembering from my own experience. How much of it have I remembered so far? Well, I've put some of that in these 3 articles called Tree Nymphs and Tree Hung Shamans, and also in the commentaries to the translations from the Andromeda. That's the mythical background. Let me give it to you in 2 sentences, because it's so fantastic to put this in a story form. According to the mystery school teaching, the divine Sophia, in her excitement, in her agitation, at a certain point, when she was pulled away from the galactic center and began to turn into the planet Earth, she became so agitated that she actually plunged through the template of the Anthropos, which is hanging like a membrane in the Orion Nebula. This template of the Anthropos is not an abstraction. It is a membrane or mycelium of molecular stellar moisture that contains all the DNA information of our species, and it's deposited in the nebula of the constellation of Orion. And she became so excited at a certain point that she plunged through that membrane and she tore it apart. This is called the shearing of the Anthropos template, or the division of the sexes. This is a great theme in ancient mythology, how the sexes became divided. As a result of that act, which was Sophia's own act, when human beings first began to appear on Earth, there were only women. The first beings that appeared on this Earth were only women human beings, no men. There were no men on the planet for hundreds of thousands of years. And these women that originally appeared, and this would have been in the period after the so-called Cambrian explosion, which was about 580 million years ago. When the first human forms appeared on Earth, they were only women, and they were tree women. They were part trees and part women. arboreal nymphs, is what they're called in mythological terms. And they were in the body of Gaia, and they were the body of Gaia. And the first women were of her body, and they reproduced themselves parthenogenetically. That is, by dreaming, and not by any kind of male seed planted in them. They produced themselves by like pods, and out of these pods they exuded a kind of plasma, and in this plasma they reproduced themselves. This is the origin of our species, but purely the female gender. And then we have to ask the question, what does the story tell us about what happened to the male counterpart of the germ plasm of the anthropos? Well, because Sophia sheared the template, the male component of the plasmic germ remained in the Orion Nebula. And so men emerged from the Orion Nebula in the form of the other part of humanity that was missing on Earth. And these are called, in the myth of the Gnostic creation myth, the Oran, or the hunters from Orion. And they were actually the missing counterpart of the women on Earth. But the women on Earth who first emerged, who are called the Gaian women, didn't know that their counterpart was missing. How could they know? The Earth emerged, the Earth grew into an organic being, it sprouted oceans, clouds, trees, it was capable of supporting symbiosis and organic life. Many species emerged, and among these species was the human species, but exclusively women. The feminists are going to love this story, because this is a story that they were looking for 30 or 40 years ago, that they didn't have. This is the story. And I have to say this about the women's liberation movement, by the way. The women's liberation movement began a noble battle that they cannot end on their own, okay? The only way that noble battle can be ended is by men and women together. And that's why the women's liberation movement has not succeeded so far. So, anyway, these Gaian women inhabited the Earth, and then, and this is something, by the way, that the kahunas tell. You were just mentioning the Hawaiian shamans, the kahunas?
Yes.
They talk about the Aka thread. Do you know about the Aka thread?
Yeah, and there's a similar metaphor in quite a few traditions. So, continue to share the significance of it in the story. The Hawaiian shamans say that there is an Aka thread, A-K-K-A, and this Aka thread is like a string of mucose that trails through space, and it actually enables us to travel from one world to another as long as this thread is intact. It's also been called the silver cord. That's right, yeah, exactly.
Right. The Tibetan kings, the original kings of Tibet, are said to have been men who descended to this earth on silver cords. And all of these are not unique to the Gnostic cosmology. You're right there, Jamie. But the Gnostic cosmology, as far as I know, contains the most comprehensive picture of this. That the first men of humanity, of our species, were not born on Earth. They weren't born out of the bodies of women. They emerged in the Orion Nebula, and they teleported to Earth using these Aka threads, or these silver cords. And they came to Earth because and they went to other planets in the galaxy as well. But they came to Earth because they were hunters, the hunters from Orion. They were a hunting species. That's what they do. And they came here because the Earth was a paradise of animals. And they came and they started to hunt the Gaian animals. And eventually they met the Gaian women, these tree nymphs, and a romance developed between the men who descended from heaven. That's not the Anunnaki. That's not extraterrestrials. That is the first men of our own species. Let's get the story straight here. A romance between those men who descended and the original indigenous women. And this romance developed over a long, long period of time. And it's through the meeting of the Orion hunters and the Gaian women that the gender rift occurred, because they were at a disadvantage because they didn't really recognize that they were two counterparts of the same species. And you know, this may sound like a really remote story, but I don't think it's that remote. Because if you sit down today, one man in front of one woman across from one man, and you look at each other, and you look in each other's eyes, I challenge you to recognize that you are members of the same species. And I challenge you to say together, let's dream what this species is. That is our true procreation.
Beautiful.
And that's basically the challenge that the teachers of the mystery schools would have put before us, because that is the challenge by which they lived. They wish to deal with this imbalance of our species, with the gender split, but they also wish to restore us to the higher vision of humanity that Sophia herself had originated. And this is what we're coming back to today. She's calling us back to that vision. She's calling us back to the magical and energetic experience of sexuality that's non-procreated. You know? She's calling us back deeply and with great intensity to this experience. So she's made her correction now. She's making it as we speak. And as she makes her correction, she wants to bring us back to this humanity. So from the Gnostic point of view, the role of every single man and woman is to restore this divine knowing of humanity and to explore it and extrapolate it together. And that is how we propagate, not by physical children, but through the erotic and magical imagination.
Well, and that's an enormous creative power as well, as we know. I mean, whether we look to the tradition of Shakti, or even more recently, as I was revisiting the writings of Audre Lorde on the power of Eros, and she's speaking of women reclaiming, you know, having forgotten, having been separated from the power of our own erotic nature of Eros, that creative energy. You know, she's going well beyond that Eros energy as it might express sexually, although it includes that, but into the Eros energy within us as that incredibly powerful, playful, sensual, creative fire, you know. So it's just interesting to draw the connections between these sorts of things, because it really helps to bring it alive for us now. You know, these stories have such incredible power, but you know, for me, John, one of the most wonderful things, and this has been part of our conversations as well, is to really bring it into an accessible form. You know, what does this wisdom mean today? So as we're talking about the teachings of the mystery schools and the knowledge of the shaman over the ages, and these wonderful stories and what they tell us, and this gender split, that we're just feeling the very yearning of Sophia for healing that and calling us back to a recognition of our divine inheritance and of our divine nature, and doing that together. What does that mean to you?
Well, good question there. I would like to concentrate the remainder of this talk on how to make this work and how to put it into action. I think that would be a great way to aim our interview. I just would say, though, about Audre Lorde, in case people don't know who she is. Yeah. Audre Lorde, Lorde, one of my great, great heroes. She was black, I believe, lesbian, I believe, feminist. She's probably also left-handed, you know, whatever. You know?
I'm sure she was, given that.
She had every transgression and taboo on her identity, you know. And she was a brilliant, brilliant, inspired spokesman of the erotic. And in fact, I honor her because Audre Lorde is the only person that I carry on Metahistory.org as a guest writer. and I have her uses of the erotic posted on the site. It is such powerful.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's incredibly inspiring, and it's one of those things, too, John, whenever I read her or any of this, whenever I revisit anything where the golden thread of wisdom is alive, I just read it anew each time or hear it anew each time, and that's, usually for me the mark of the real presence of timeless wisdom. But she's an incredibly wise and inspiring voice.
Great. She was really fantastic, and that essay can be read over and over again and savored over and over again. It is so true. Of course, the first thing we have to do to make all of this rich and magnificent material real is to reclaim the erotic in ourselves, men and women. That was her message. So I would suggest kind of an ABC maybe that we could proceed on to put the things we're discussing in this interview, into practice. Okay? How can we do it? Let me see if I can offer these suggestions. The first thing, A, is that whether you reproduce or not, I don't want to have a beef with people who have children. I personally don't have any. I'm just too selfish to have had any children, frankly, and I don't want to get into adversarial or judgmental stance toward people who have children, okay? But I would like to say this. Whether you have them or not, please try to consider that the purpose of sexuality is non-reproductive. So even if you have kids, you can still continue to have sexual intercourse in a non-reproductive way. Now, what is the purpose of having sex if you don't reproduce? Well, these, F-U-C-K-I-N-G, Abrahamic religions, which is exactly what they are, elevate procreation as if it's a divine calling. That is absolutely perverse. Not a divine calling, it's a mistake. We were never meant to reproduce this way. So you might have to ask, well, what's the option if we're given these sexual organs and the way they fit together and the way this whole thing works? What's the point of it if it's not to reproduce? The point of it is to love humanity and reproduce humanity. To reproduce humanity, but not to reproduce human progeny. That's the point of our sexual energy. So that's the first orientation. That's kind of like, Jamie, that's kind of like a metanoia, okay? Let's get out of the paradigm of biological reproduction, and let's go to the metanoia of a new paradigm, which is non-biological reproduction. We're not going to reproduce your offspring or your sons and daughters down to the 9th generation. You're going to reproduce the divine vision of humanity as it originated in her mind. That is a fantastic thing to do.
And that's a very sensual, rather than an intellectual thing.
That's right, exactly. Second point that I would say toward the application of this vision and the option is that we hold in the highest regard that which Sophia, holds in the highest regard. We want to align with her, then align with her point of view. And what is her point of view? Well, the first time that I communicated with her directly on Infinity Ridge here in Andalusia, almost exactly 9 years ago, May of 2002, I realized that I had her attention. It's sort of like being on the line, and say, hold the line, we'll put you through to her, we'll put you through, and suddenly she's on the line, right? Wow, and I'm talking to her just like I'm talking to you, and anybody can do this, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm not presenting myself as some evangelic guru Gaia here. Anybody?
No, we're all Sophia's children, and that's the great thing for us to remember.
She wants us all to remember her, and she wants to talk to all of us direct, not through an intermediary of any kind.
right.
So I was talking to her direct, and I can teach people how to do it. It's my pleasure to say that. And I said, okay, tell me where it's at. She said, my priorities are aesthetic. That was it. All my
Say
priorities
that again. Say it once more.
She told me that her priorities are aesthetic. Beauty is what she cares about. She said, laws of physics, they're all the laws of beauty. Follow the laws of beauty and you will follow my way. This is what she told me.
Mm-hmm.
She is all about beauty. Beauty is a solution to everything. It's a solution to physics. It's also the solution to ethics. You know what she taught me? Don't get involved in ethics. Don't get involved in questions of what is right and wrong. Oh yeah, go back and read Marcus Aurelius and understand what pagan ethics were. That's important. But the only thing you have to know about ethics is that every beautiful action is good and every evil action is ugly. That's all you have to know. It's ugly. If it's wrong, it's ugly. And look at the ugliness of what is being done in the world and to the world. And look at the ugliness of human behavior. We know it's wrong because it's ugly. Truth is beauty. This is what she taught me. And so the second part of the practice is to enter into beauty and to revere beauty, to make a religion of beauty. And that means sexual beauty, the beauty of emotional expression, the beauty of words, the beauty of the way that we share and exchange tenderness, the beauty of our respect for each other, the beauty of our common regard for the sacred. Live in beauty and you live in her way. This is the way to practice Gnostic teachings.
Mm-hmm. And that's it sounds incredibly simple, and yet when we tell ourselves that, when we hear that, when we share that, you can feel the power of that mantra. You know what I mean? You can feel the power of that mantra.
You can indeed. It sounds incredibly simple, but I'm telling you, and it is simple, but it is simple, and Jamie, I like to use the word rigorous.
Yes, it is.
It is
so
simple,
things can be simple, and that doesn't make them easy.
That's right. It's very rigorous. It's like some years after that, that was 2002, 6 years after that, when I got the first instructions of the Terma of Gaia Awakening, it was also equally simple. The first instruction of that Terma is, you cannot become anything but more beautiful. Now, that sounds very simple. That is one sentence of like 8 words. But I defy you to repeat that sentence and look at that sentence and practice that. You cannot become anything but more beautiful. That means that you cannot become more intelligent. You cannot become less intelligent. You cannot become more wise. You cannot become more kind. You cannot become anything except more beautiful. What kind of a teaching is that? That is
an incredibly profound, sensually based teaching that brings us to our senses. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I remember receiving that, in 2005 when I was in France, and that was it. Literally coming to your senses.
That's right.
Not mental senses, but actual embodied senses. The path of sensual presence is what I saw it as, but it's very much what you're talking about, John.
That's beautiful, the path of sensual presence. And Jamie, it doesn't just bring us to our senses, but it also brings us to our ethics.
Yeah.
Because if you act beautifully every day, and if you treat yourself beautifully, and you treat people beautifully, you don't have to worry about right or wrong. They will sort themselves out just fine. And so the third point I'd like to make toward the application, and this is really the point that leads into planetary Torah. You had asked the question in the notes, what is gender healing and gender love, and what does it mean to refine the sacred relationship between the genders?
That's right.
To refine and recreate it. Well, the word sacred is from the Sanskrit root shak, which is the root of Shakti, the name of the divine feminine. The word sacred simply means powerful. Power. This is about power. but it's not about patriarchal power and the power of domination. It's not about the power of one person to dominate the other. It's the power that we acquire by sharing our potential and sharing our knowledge and our love. And so I've often said that planetary Tantra, which is the most direct path into interactivity with Sophia, is a power-sharing arrangement with the planet. And I truly believe that every human relation, that the love and sexuality of the future is a triangulation of man and woman and her. There has to be the third point. So the power sharing of the genders is within the frame of her power. It is a way of celebrating and exploring and developing her power. And I believe that that is truly the course that the Gnostics would have directed us on, back to her, if they had survived and if their message had been carried through the centuries without having been destroyed.
That's really beautiful, and it's a great endpoint as well. So we have this invitation to do a full sensory meditation and hold that sacred intention of embodying and living the beauty way, you know, and exploring with Sophia what that means. You know, that energy and awareness and intelligence that's within and around us. We are Sophia's children. And we can enter into that conversation that might be both auditory, we might actually hear it, we might see it, but we will certainly sense it. And from that we can gain the inspiration and energy that we need to kind of move into that experiment of living beauty every day. It's certainly a different sort of medicine, and it is a different sort of power, for sure.
For sure. It's power with and not power over.
Right.
Yeah. Power with is beautiful. It
really is. And, you know, it also reflects the beauty, in the very origins of that story, if we go back to the origins of the Sophia story, that great yearning to create something beautiful. You know, really, that's what we can interpret that as and co-create, you know, through the energies of life and through that deep yearning and deep desire and in that amazing power of dreaming or imagining into being. And those are, you know, gifts that we too have been given if we choose to use them in service of this. So that would be the great invitation. And as you said, John, it's rigorous. It takes reverence and discipline, but perhaps of the very best kind.
Well, yes, that is the divine experiment that she's calling us to now. And it does take rigor, but there's great beauty in that rigor. It's like the beauty in being a dancer and being a singer and doing anything skillful. A certain amount of that rigor and discipline comes into play. It's not a burden, but it is a joy, and it's the way that we reach our highest potential. And if the Gnostic teaching of the Anthropos was about anything at all, it's about the highest potential of our species.
Yeah, and I often think that that's exactly perhaps, or it's inclusive of what it meant to seek first Sophia, and all of these other things shall be given to you.
Exactly. That's the principle. Yeah,
so again,
right.
We take something that we might have, that might have been seek first the kingdom, because that's what that ended up being interpreted as, but the root would be more queendom, and it would be even more seek first Sophia. Sophia delights in lavishing upon her children. So these are such beautiful energy waves to end our conversation on. Thank you, John, once again. I'm so grateful that you joined me for these inspired conversations about Sophia and us as children of Sophia, and living the gifts on her behalf as well as on behalf of all of humanity. So thanks for joining me in this series.
My pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Jamie.
You're most welcome. And listeners, once again, you've been listening to Lamb Lash on the Feminine Mojo Show, and this is Jamie Walters, the host of the Feminine Mojo Show. You can find out more about John and some of the things that we've mentioned in this conversation at metahistory.org, and you can find more about upcoming Feminine Mojo shows, the Feminine Mojo archives, where you will find the first of the 4 conversations in this Sophia Series between John and I. And you'll find also more information about other Feminine Mojo projects that are dedicated and devoted to supporting this great awakening that John and I have been talking about today, each in our own way, are rising to that call and expressing and experimenting into doing that. So I give you great thanks for listening and joining us today, and look forward to having you join us again next time. Take good care, everyone. Greetings, everyone. Welcome once again to the Feminine Mojo Show here on Blog Talk Radio. I'm your host, Jamie Walters, author and creatrix of IVC and the Feminine Mojo projects. You'll find more information and inspiration on the Feminine Mojo projects and reclaiming your own feminine mojo at www.ivysea.com. We all have the invitation right now in these transformative times to align with the wisdom and power of our hearts, reclaim the feminine and the deep wisdom we have access to. These gifts and practices help us navigate, vision, co-create, and orienteer in the midst of changes and transformations that are afoot. And they're gifts and ways of being and seeing that we've been systematically oriented away from in our culture. So join me in the Feminine Mojo Mystery School, and we've got some new surprises to unveil over the coming week or so. But you can explore with us the feminine more deeply to embody and express it as it wants to express through you. There are already audio programs in the archives on the medial feminine, Persephone and Inanna wisdom, Bridget, and inspiration of the initiations, Circe as she inspires us to weave magic into our everyday ways of being and activities, the Black Madonna, and more. All of these are really potent archetypes and deeply awakening and catalyzing stories, and so much of our shows, and this show today as well, bring to life the living memory within us that we have when we hear some of these stories and when we look at and reacquaint ourselves with some of the symbols. So you'll find more in the Feminine Mojo Mystery School, including some of the new changes and evolutions that are going to be unveiled over the next week or so, and other Feminine Mojo projects, Sophia's Children blog, and the other resources at ivysea.com. And one other reminder before we begin today's conversation, remember that you can download the Feminine Mojo shows from the archive. It used to be that you could download the MP3s directly, and that was a whole lot easier, but you can still find that to download and listen to the shows via iTunes or one of your other players if you'd like, or you can listen to them on your browser as well as you're going throughout your day. So you'll find all of those in the Feminine Mojo Show archives. There's so many wonderful conversations that are deeply inspiring and deeply awakening for some of the things that we really are called to remember right now. So now for today's Feminine Mojo-inspired dialogue with Lamb Lash. If you're listening live and want to call in with questions for John during the show, and it'll be another in-depth one, the number is 347-989-1293. That's in the U.S., 347-989-1293. And you'll find that also on the Feminine Mojo Show page as well. This is the 5th in a powerful series of inspired conversations about the...
So I've debated whether or not, it's one thing to bring her to the attention of the world. It's another thing as to how she was handled in public attention. And you've pointed out that you've been reading my piece, The Gnostic Avenger. There are 3 key pieces, the only things that anyone needs to read on metahistory.org to get an orientation to this subject today. That we're discussing, Jamie, is The Gnostic Avenger, She Who Anoints, which is a review of a book by Karen King, a feminist Gnostic scholar, and The Myth of Choice, which is in 3 parts, which discusses the relation between Jesus and Magdalene from a pagan point of view. And the second part of that Myth of Choice is called The Backstory, and that does give an actual profile of, as you're suggesting, a profile of of a way that we might picture these two characters in ancient times, picturing them as telestai, that is to say, initiated or illuminated teachers from the mystery schools. So it's really worth revisiting this Christ Magdalene scenario in that respect, and then rebounding off that again to the subject of gender healing and so forth. It's a great place to start. So I would start in this way. I would say that I just want to address as quickly as possible and as lucidly as possible two really essential points of orientation. The first one concerns this annoying notion, which I really found really disturbing when the Da Vinci Code came out. In fact, I found it disturbing when Sacred Blood, Holy Blood, Holy Grail came out, which was 20 years before the Da Vinci Code. And some people may not know it, but a nonfiction book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, written by Michael Bagent and Lincoln and Lai, by three authors, L-E-I-G-H, Bagent, Lincoln, and Lai, was the basis upon which Dan Brown drew the novel, The Da Vinci Code. And it is that book, published I think around the late 70s, that presents this notion to which I strongly object. Namely, Mary Magdalene was a key figure in ancient times. She was an important figure in the biblical New Testament scenario, but only to the degree as she served as a kind of breed mare for a theocratic lineage. So, or a trophy wife for the Messiah, if you want to put it in those terms.
Oh my God. Yeah, I hear you.
So we're getting this message, which to me, I was so upset. And, it's interesting because, interesting timing that metahistory.org, which is largely dedicated, well, totally dedicated to Gaia Sophia and equally dedicated to Magdalene as a human representative of the divine Sophia, came online in July 2002. And that was when the Da Vinci Code thing just was really cranking up. So I put quite a bit of material on about her at that time. As I say, if you just look at the three pieces that I just cited, which you'll find under on the MM connection in the site, it covers that material. Well, this is what I object to, and this is what Gnostics of the time would have objected to. Mary Magdalene, as the partner of Jesus or wife of Jesus, could not have been a woman who bore his children for the purpose of establishing a theocratic lineage in the world. That is entirely perverse. That is entirely perverse from the viewpoint of the pagan background, but equally from the viewpoint of Gnostics. Gnostics were teachers in the mystery schools. They were educated and illuminated intellectuals. They were the intelligentsia of their time. Not just the intelligentsia, they were the flower of the whole intelligentsia of the pagan world. And they were deeply gifted and skilled as mystics and shamans, and deeply versed in the mysteries of eroticism, of sexual tantra, as well as in problems of theology and science and metaphysics. They were polymaths, people who were educated in different fields of knowledge. Now, what happens if we place Jesus and Mary Magdalene in this framework? Let's say that we try to re-envision them independent of any of the attributes given to them by Christianity, and try to see what they would have been as telestai, teachers in the mystery schools. Well, in the first place, they would not have procreated a sacred blood lineage, because the idea of a sacred blood lineage is actually one of the most demonic ideas on this planet. It is just a pretext for a form of New World Order mentality. It is a dominator system. The sacred bloodline concept belongs to the dominator system.
hey, that's what everybody wants to see anyway. We just have to have good context, so we know what story we're living, right?
Precisely. We have to know what is the context of the love scene. That's exactly true. Beautifully said.
So we'll circle back around to just a minute, John, but usually, as you know, I like to start by recapping the connection between these subjects and the Sophia or Sophia story, kind of creating that golden thread or revealing that golden thread between our conversations. And by defining the terms we're using so we're all aligned and we can move forward together from a foundation of shared understanding and energy connection. But today I'd like to dive into the subject through another doorway and perhaps circle back to those connections and definitions as we deepen into this conversation. So one story, an example of sacred relationship and perhaps the gender healing that's surfacing more recently, or that we have an invitation to become aware of and engaged in, is that of Mary Magdalene and Jesus from what ultimately became Christianity or the Christian tradition. Understand that I'm not talking here about were they married and did they have children brouhaha stirred up by the Da Vinci Code and other of its sources. That is a very fine question and an area of exploration if you're into it, and as it happens, I don't actually care. But for me, that's kind of a tabloid culture style distraction from far more important and juicy issues. So alternatively, I resonate very deeply with a piece of John's writing about this famous pair. So I'd like to use that as a springboard into our conversation on this gender split, gender healing issue that we'll be exploring in depth today. John, the piece I'm talking about is where you explore Jesus and Mary Magdalene as possible telestai, given that their examples seem, from what we know, to very much sync up. Would you take a short bit of time to share more about this with the listeners? What are telestai, and how might that example sync up with the example of Jesus and Mary Magdalene? And then we'll kind of move right from there into this conversation about different ways of seeing gender split and gender healing. Can you share more about Jesus, Magdalene, and telestai?
Sure. I'm happy to follow your lead here. I think that to revisit this topic just for a moment is important. After all, let's not forget that the Da Vinci Code book and the whole scandal of Mary Magdalene, if you want to call it that was produced during those years, did create a tremendous uproar and brought the figure of Mary Magdalene to the attention of many people in the world who had been entirely ignorant of her. I think you would agree with that.
Absolutely.
Of course.
Sophia's story and the mysteries and how wisdom of the mystery schools and ancient shamanic traditions is very, very, very alive and relevant and practical and timely today. We might not think so, but once you start hearing it, it makes so much sense. And in the first 4 interviews, the first 4 conversations that have been part of this really rich Sophia series, and you'll find them again in the Feminine Mojo Show archives. But John and I talked about the story of Sophia Gaia, the mysteries and the wisdom that is so valuable to us now. We talked about our divine inheritance and what that divine endowment are, what those divine gifts are that we've been endowed with, and what gets in the way of our knowing and expressing these gifts. In the 4th show, John shared more of his own experiential wisdom with the divine light, or the organic light of Sophia Gaia, that's part of the heart of the mysteries. And today, in this 5th conversation about Sophia Mysteries, John and I will be talking about sacred relationship, the gender split, gender love, and gender healing that's really vital to us now. We'll talk about what the roots of that gender split are, and perhaps a surprising potential connection in the relationship that we now see unfolding and maybe understanding it a little bit differently than we might have at one point of the relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus for one example of these types of things. So if you're not already familiar with John Lash's work, he's the author of Not in His Image, Gnostic Vision, Sacred Ecology, and the Future of Belief. If you haven't read it yet, do put it on your list. And you'll also find John's work and wisdom on metahistory.org and on the Sophia Returning the Path to Planetary Tantra DVD. And you'll find that at sacredmysteries.com, and you'll find information at John's site, metahistory.org, as well. John Lamb Lash is often called the true successor of Mircea Eliade and the rightful heir of the great mythologist Joseph Campbell. He's a self-educated independent scholar who combines studies and experimental mysticism to teach directive mythology. That is the application of myth to life rather than its mere interpretation. So really bringing it alive. And he has also authored The Seeker's Handbook, Twins and the Double, The Hero, Manhood and Power, and The Quest for the Zodiac. Once more, you'll find more about John at his website, metahistory.org. Welcome back to the Feminine Mojo Show, John.
It's great to be back again. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It's always a pleasure, and it's always so wonderful to see what emerges and unfolds and evolves in our conversations. So I'm sure this will be no different.
We've been on quite a journey here, and I think the Magic 5 has arrived. So, as they say in Hollywood, let's cut to the chase, or in this case, let's cut to the love